some of the supposedly brightest people can come up with some of the dumbest and most insane ideas.
I felt like it's very important that we bring in an evolutionary psychologist to explain what the bleep is happening in the West.
Communism has been tried, and the answer is always the same. Great idea, wrong species. Many medical schools are removing grading.
Don't get married, hookup culture, don't have children. I gotta show this one to you. Doja Cat, look at what she's done to herself.
Oh my, I am allergic to BS.
What is this parasitic mind that we have developed here in the West? Professor Gad Saad, I am so glad that you're here because times are just so crazy that we needed to speak to an evolutionary psychologist to figure out what on earth is happening to our society. Are we devolving into complete craziness? And so to just get started, will you explain what is evolutionary psychology?
Yes. Perfect. Well, so good to be with you. Evolutionary psychology is simply applying the principles of evolution to study why our minds are the way that they are. So in the same way that I can explain why we have opposable thumbs through an evolutionary lens, why our respiratory system is the way that it is, there's no reason why we can't apply the tools of evolution to explain our most important organ that defines our personhood, which is our mind. And so, for example, if I want to understand why are men sexually territorial, not that women are not, but men more so. Men will go to homicidal rages if they either have suspected or realized infidelity. So an evolutionary psychologist would say, why would men have evolved that particular response? And the answer from an evolutionary perspective would be because of paternity uncertainty. We are a biparental species. Human males do invest a lot in their children, not as much as women, but a lot more than other dads in the animal kingdom. Therefore, it doesn't make sense that your male ancestors and mine would have evolved a laissez-faire attitude to their women going around the bushes with every second guy coming through town, because then I would spend all of my time and energy raising someone else's child. Therefore, my emotional system, my cognitive system, my behavioral system is designed to ensure that I thwart the threats of paternity uncertainty. So that's what an evolutionary psychologist does. He or she looks for the evolutionary reasons why our minds operate the way they do.
Good. So maybe you can explain to me, why do we have a woke mind virus going through our society? I mean, so much of it is in your Parasitic Mind book. And so what is this parasitic mind that we have developed here in the West?
So I've been now a professor. I'm going into my 31st year. There are many wonderful things in the university setting, but I very quickly noticed that some of the supposedly brightest people on earth, they're called professors, can come up with some of the dumbest and most insane ideas, because all of those parasitic ideas, postmodernism, cultural relativism, radical feminism, social constructivism, were all spawned on university campuses. So why? What's so alluring about these ideas? So I use the parasitic framework for one important reason. So let me give you a specific example. The wood cricket is a cricket that abhors water. When it is parasitized by a hairworm, the hairworm needs the wood cricket to jump in water for it to complete its reproductive cycle. So it will alter the circuitry of the wood cricket, which historically would abhor going into water. It will now merrily jump into the water to its death in the service of the parasite. And so I had my eureka moment. I would use a neuroparasitological framework to argue that human beings can not only be parasitized by actual physical brainworms, they could be parasitized by ideological brainworms, hence the idea in the parasitic mind.
So can you give me some examples of what you have noticed that are particularly parasitic?
Yes.
I know I have my choice of them, and I'm going to ask you about them, but some of the ones that you talked about in your books are so jarring and so obvious, I think, to some of us. But you came out with this book a while ago.
Right. So the granddaddy of all parasitic ideas is postmodernism, because it purports that there are no absolute truths other than the one absolute truth that there are no absolute truths. So imagine how anti-scientific that statement is, because a scientist wakes up in the morning and says that, yes, there is a truth to be discovered. Now, in science, truth can change. It's always provisional truth. What we thought was true in science 300 years ago, we've revised since. But we do operate on the premise that there is an epistemologically findable truth. Otherwise, there's no point in getting out of bed in the morning. Well, postmodernism is the antithesis of that. It says we are completely shackled by subjectivity. We're completely shackled by biases, by relativism. And so you can't speak of any absolute truth. Well, that's the framework that then allows a lot of the other parasitic ideas to flourish. If there is no truth with a capital T, then surely your genitalia doesn't define whether you're male or female. It's my feeling that defines whether I'm male or female. Surely there is no such thing as innate sex differences between men and women. That must be a social construction. So it all originally flows from that framework that says up is down, left is right. Who are you to say what is right or wrong? And so that's why I think there is no greater parasitic ideology than postmodernism.
So you're a mathematician. You're a professor at one of the most well-known universities in Canada. And you were asked to essentially augment your field to fit within what we're calling this parasitic woke mind virus, right? So the example you were sharing with me earlier about trying to take evolution and wokeify it was one of the, I think, my understanding, triggering moments for you where you said, I just can't keep lying about things. I just think it's such a mind-boggling example. I'd love for you to just share that.
Well, I never lie, never, ever, to a detriment to my career, because had I been able to play the game, maybe if I didn't have a big mouth, I could have had a position at UC Irvine or UCSD, but I can't lie because professors are meant to be dispensers of truth. So originally in my career, my goal was to incorporate evolutionary thinking in studying human behavior in general and consumer behavior in particular. So the idea is that you can't study consumer behavior if you don't understand the hormonal influences that shape our food choices. Or, for example, this is from my own research with one of my former graduate students, women dress a lot more sexily when they're in the maximally fertile phase of their menstrual cycles. Because when you are ovulating, this is when you, in a sense, are most likely to be assiduously engaging in sexual signaling. And you see that behavior across many mammalian species, where females of that species are more likely to engage in sexual signaling when maximally fertile. In other species, you call it being an estrus. Well, human females will do it through the product choices that they will use. You're more likely to wear stilettos when you are ovulating. You're more likely to be scantily clad when you're ovulating. Well, that to me seemed like a very obvious proposition, a very obvious thing to test. Well, to my social scientist friends, I went from, a reasonable guy to being Nazi, because applying biology to explain human behavior was simply grotesque. It was biological determinism. And to me, it seemed insane. So you think that biology applies to every single species on Earth except one, called humans? Somehow humans operate outside of their biology. So the original parasitic thinking that I was exposed to was in the pursuit of my academic career. And then the longer I stayed within the university ecosystem, I started seeing these departures from reason left, right, and center, eventually culminating in writing The Parasitic Mind.
One of the things I've picked up from you over the past few years is this concept of the maladaptive behavior.
Right.
And, one has to wonder and really talk to an evolutionist to understand why are we evolving into taking on behaviors that actually hurt our species. So I could think about the obvious example, which is don't get married, hookup culture, don't have children, right? Why would humans not want to have children? I mean, that is really going to end our species, right? And then you think about other examples where, look at this. I got to show this one to you. This gorgeous woman, Doja Cat.
Yes.
Okay. Look at her. So pretty. Okay.
Yes,
so pretty. It's just naturally beautiful. Look at what she's done to herself. Just look at these pictures. It's just, look at this.
Oh my.
Look at this.
I've never seen this one.
It's devastating. How is this? Look at what she looked like. So, Professor, how is this not maladaptive?
Right.
Why are young, beautiful women making themselves look horrible?
So I can't speak for Doja Cat, but I do in several of my earlier books talk about dark side consumption, so compulsive buying, eating disorders, pornographic addictions, pathological gambling. Each of those behaviors are maladaptive. So what would be the evolutionary reason why people are so easily succumbing to these behavioral traps? And so I argue that each of these behaviors started off being adaptive, but then they misfire. So the maladaptive part is a misfiring of an otherwise adaptive process. I know it sounds like a mouthful, so let me explain. Take, for example, compulsive buying, which is a psychiatric condition. But this is not, I own 5 pairs of stilettos or 6 ties. It's when the behavior becomes so dysfunctional that I'm now eating away into our son's or daughter's university funds. I'm about to divorce because I'm spending all the money collecting products, right? So it has to be a dysfunction for it to be maladaptive. Well, it turns out that 90% of compulsive buyers are women. Now, in my earlier book, even before I had read the literature, I could predict for you, because I'm an evolutionist, what it was that they were hoarding. I knew that the women who suffer from compulsive buying would unlikely be hoarding electronic cameras or lawnmowers, but what they hoard are beautification products, right? Now, so what's happening there? The beautification mechanism is perfectly adaptive. So that is adaptive, right? We use whatever the other sex is interested in to ameliorate our lot in the mating market. So that's adaptive. The maladaptive part is when it starts misfiring. So in the context of a woman who wants to beautify herself, she buys 900 pairs of stiletto shoes. She buys 6,000 lipstick things. And so the mechanism goes on hyperdrive. And let me just pull back a second. OCD, which is a psychiatric condition, obsessive compulsive disorder, can be explained using a similar mechanism. The idea of scanning the environment for threats makes perfect sense. Checking that the back door is locked. Somebody sneezed and I saw them and then they shook my hands. I go and wash my hands. The problem is when that environmental scanning for threats misfires, so that now, instead of washing my hands once for 3 seconds, I spend 8 hours washing it obsessively in scalding hot water. So many of these maladaptive behaviors are nothing but misfirings of otherwise adaptive processes.
So I get that. And you would think that the misfires would be something that is more rare. But now it's becoming less of a rare trait. Now it's becoming a cultural trend. And so how is this new cultural trend of misfiring, of exaggerating, I guess, what you would say was originally supposed to be adaptive, becoming something so commonplace?
Can you give me a specific example of a behavior? Because I think the explanation would be different for each behavior. Let's say what Doja's doing.
Yeah, what Doja's doing, right? So she's so beautiful, and it started with these beautiful pictures of her, right? In the beginning, these beautiful pictures, and suddenly it just becomes maladaptive. Suddenly it's like, well, wait a second. Does anybody even want to look at these pictures?
So I can't speak for her case, but I could speak of a related example. So eating disorders, where women end up being quite phenotypic, physically unattractive, right? They're emaciated, they weigh 60 pounds. Why would a woman ever think that that's the right thing to do? They look at themselves in the mirror, they're 70 pounds, they're bones, and yet they still think they should lose weight. Well, there is the usual social science explanation is that it's the thin image ideal that you see in media that causes women to do that. But that can't be right, because number one, out of 100 women that see the exact same images, only 1 to 3 of them will become anorexic. So that can't be the explanation. We also know from ancient Greece, Hippocrates had identified eating disorders in the exact same form as we have today. They didn't have the same media images. So that can't be it. So what's the evolutionary explanation? Well, it turns out that when you are anorexic, one of the first things that happen is you get amenorrhea, which is the shutting off of your menstrual cycle. Now, there's primary amenorrhea. That's when you haven't had your menstrual cycle yet, and it's delayed because you don't have enough fat reserves. But usually most women will get anorexic at 18, 19, where they already had their menstrual cycles, but now it's shut off. Now, why is this relevant to the story? It turns out that women who are anorexic, whether rightly so or wrongly so, believe that they shouldn't be entering the reproductive window now. And therefore, by becoming anorexic, by uglifying themselves, they are shutting off their reproductive potential. That's called the reproductive suppression model. So I don't know if for whatever reason, Doja Cat, who is a gorgeous, beautiful, successful woman, has decided that she needs to make herself ugly to delay her reproductive potential. But that's the usual argument used for anorexia, which might be related to what she's doing.
You know, you bring up the issue of anorexia, and I think many moms like me are witnessing that actually there are less young women dealing with anorexia today as when we were younger,
Right.
but more of them are now dealing with gender dysphoria.
Right.
It almost feels like that issue has been replaced with the issue of anorexia has been replaced with gender dysphoria. I don't know if you noticed that too, but I also think of gender dysphoria and, boys wanting to become women, women wanting to become men, going through the chemical castration and the surgical castration. That is also obviously maladaptive. It's certainly not healthy for people's bodies.
Exactly. Well, listen, and in The Consuming Instinct, which was a book I wrote in 2011, in the opening chapter, I say, in many universities, you now teach that homosexuality is innate, whereas heterosexuality is learned as part of the heteronormative imposition. Now, it doesn't take a fancy evolutionary psychologist to know that for a sexually reproducing species, it can't be that homosexuality is natural, whereas heterosexuality is just imposed by heteronormativity. But that's when I started getting the idea for writing The Parasitic Mind, because I would read that stuff. Oftentimes I would be sitting on granting agencies where we are reviewing the research. I'd say, what kind of BS is this stuff? And it's collecting 30 years of these insane stories that led to The Parasitic Mind.
You know, when you talk about collecting stories and just studying history, it makes me think about another maladaptive behavior, which is the erasure of history, right? So the removing of the statutes and the removing of the plaques and the removing of, frankly, even the Bible, right? This idea that only the new is worth reading,
right,
and the old is worth throwing away. And how is that not a maladaptive behavior for human society to not learn from the past?
So that's a great question, and I loved your segue. Many ideologies will always start off by erasing past manifestations of history of societies that existed before them, because only when they come to power is when the light is shown, right? So, for example, in Islam, what do? You bring down the Buddha statues in the Taliban, right? Wherever Islam goes, you get rid of any artifacts of previous societies because it was darkness before Islam. Now, the progressives in a Western context are doing exactly the same thing. By the way, I'm going to come back to the story. In the happiness book, I talk about how conservative consistently score higher on happiness than progressives. And I offer a speculative, but I think quite plausible explanation, which relates to your question. The conservative wakes up in the morning and says, yeah, our society may not be perfect, but there's a lot of things that are worth conserving. Hence, I'm conservative, right? So existentially, I'm happy. Yes, we can tinker here and we can tinker there, but overall, we have a good system.
It's a happier perspective.
It's a happier perspective. The progressive wakes up and says, we are a racist, misogynist, we had slavery, we indigenous, transgender, Islamophobia. Around the corner lies unicornia. And so if only I can erase everything that is, to your question, I get rid of all existing manifestations of the current evil society, around the corner I will have existential glee. And so I think that's why there is that reflex in many of these totalitarian ideologies to erase everything that came before you.
Do you think that conservatives do have some maladaptive behaviors too? Are we, I don't know, angrier? I'm trying to think what the left would say about us.
Look, I don't think your political orientation inoculates you against all possible traps of life, right? So, for example, in my field, conservatives are much more likely to deny evolution, whereas liberals and progressives are much more likely to deny evolutionary psychology. Now, why? The conservatives usually detest evolution because they see it as a frontal attack on their religious beliefs. Don't tell me that there is an impartial, random mechanism that created the beauty of that flower. It must be a manifestation of a godly designer. And so I don't believe in your evolution nonsense. That's the conservative who says that to me. The leftist says to me, oh, no, I believe in evolution. I just don't believe when you apply evolution to explain the human mind. Don't tell me that there are innate sex differences between men and women. That's Nazism. Men and women are only different through social construction. So I just gave you an example where both camps could be equally imbecilic for different reasons. So I don't think being conservative or liberal inoculates you against parasitic ideas, although in the book, all of the parasitic ideas are inherently leftist because I come from the university ecosystem, and the university ecosystem is largely inhabited by leftist professors. So that's why all of those parasitic ideas come from the left.
So we can obviously talk for a very long time about all of these maladaptive behaviors. I want to bring up one more, which
Sure.
is one that has really impacted, I think, our society right now, and that is young people being taught to lower standards, right? And I see the lowering of standards not just happening in schools where, I used to be a teacher, I used to run a school. And so every year we were told to lower our expectations, right? Next year we should have the standards even lowered. And then even once you go into the business environment, right? Like, how dare you be a CEO that expects so much of your staff member? How dare you push these people? You're so mean, right? You should be that amazing commander in chief that can just cackle with your audience, right? Like, that is what we should strive for, as opposed to striving for excellence, sometimes toughness, right? Those kinds of things. Would you say that the lowering of standards is also some sort of misfiring of a maladaptive behavior?
I mean, indeed. And so let me give you a few examples. Going back to Seneca several thousand years ago, he's got a great quote, which I use as an epigraph in one of the chapters in the happiness book. I don't remember the exact quote, so I'm going to paraphrase it. He says that when you look at a tree, the trees that have been exposed to a lot of wind stressors end up being very well rooted because they have to evolve the capacity to be able to withstand, in this case, a singular stressor called, wind velocity. Trees that haven't been exposed to a lot of wind stressors end up being very brittle. And now you take that principle, which was an incredible insight from 2,500 years ago, and now you apply it in today's parlance. You have Nassim Taleb, who's a fellow Lebanese, who talks about anti-fragility. Well, Seneca already said it 2,500 years ago. Many systems will optimally operate if they are exposed to stressors. So when you reduce the standards, you are removing the stressors that allow you to optimally flourish. So let me give you a specific example from evolutionary medicine. It turns out that kids who are raised in environments with no allergens, no pet dander, no dust, they're not growing up on a farm, end up having a lot greater incidence of asthma than kids who did grow up with those allergens. Why? Because your immune system expects in order for it to operate maximally, it needs to face those stressors, in this case, allergens, right? So now let's apply it to university settings. If you're not willing to be exposed to stressors called opposing ideas, because any opposing idea becomes a violence to me because you should exactly believe as I do, how can you become a critical thinker? Because I'm a much better critical thinker if I'm exposed to opposing ideas that allows me to better hone my message against those ideas. So you're exactly right. Lowering the standards, removing the stressors, creating an environment that is not anti-fragile is not the way for optimal flourishing.
It really makes me think about the participation trophies that probably the generation before me started giving out, because now people just expect to be rewarded because they just, showed up, right? It's like, well, what do you mean? I tried so hard. I tried so hard.
I get that in my classes where a student comes to me, says, okay, well, I got a B- in my final grade, but that's not fair, professor. I say, well, why is it unfair? Because I studied so hard. But who cares? If I go see my physician and my physician gives me my cholesterol scores, do I try to negotiate a better cholesterol score because I tried so hard? Or that's my cholesterol score? So you studied however hard you did. You clearly didn't retain the material that is necessary. Now get out of my office, right? So, but they expect, exactly to your point, that because I tried so hard, here is the ribbon. By the way, grades, and I talk about this in the parasitic mind, 30, 40 years ago, the average grade in university, as should be, was a C. Do you know what the average grade is in American universities now? The average grade, A.
The average grade
Yeah.
is A. So
We-
they're just giving them out like
A's
jelly
left, right, and
beans.
center. I even had now in Canada, we're not quite, when it comes to some of these things, we're not quite as bad, perhaps because we don't pay $80,000 a year to go to university.
Right.
Therefore,
Oh,
the
right.
students don't feel as entitled. Hey, I'm paying $80,000.
Right.
You give me the A plus, because otherwise I don't get the job with the Procter and Gamble. So we don't quite have it as entitled. But even in Canada now, when I give my grades, and oftentimes they're quite low,
Wow.
I'll get the department chair writing to me and saying, can you explain your grades? Why do I have to explain to you my grades? They came out as they came out. If everybody fails, too bad. If everybody gets A plus, good for you. There is no gaming the system, but that makes the students feel bad about themselves. So can you please give them better grades? No, I won't.
Well, I mean, that is parasitic to me.
That is parasitic.
Right? I mean, this idea that everybody just gets an A or we just lower the standards so that everybody gets an A. I'm like, no wonder they were okay with DEI, right? Because if merit doesn't matter, if doing a great job doesn't matter, all that matters is that you just show up, quite literally, right? Yep. Then all standards go bye-bye.
Exactly. By the way, both in the US and in Canada, now in medical schools, many medical schools are removing grading because, boo-hoo-hoo, medical students have it so tough. You don't want them to create that competitive environment. When you have a trauma surgeon that's going to operate on you and is going to make decisions that are life or death, do you want them to have been exposed to the stressor called grading? Or do you want them to have, grown up in an environment of I'm okay, you're okay? It's grotesque.
Well, I think it's also beyond that. I think most CEOs or whatever business enterprise we're talking about, we don't want to hire people who expect to get accolades and raises and titles and all of that because people maybe showed up for the most part to work, right? Yeah. We want to reward people who do a great job. We want people who work hard and think critically. But what I'm saying right now is such an HR violation, especially given that we're sitting here in California, right? You are not allowed to expect more out of people. And I think that entire mentality is what you talk about in your book. It's parasitic. It is maladaptive. Human society cannot flourish if we constantly just lower the bar to just make people feel good.
And I'll even add another evolutionary angle. So E.O. Wilson was a famous Harvard biologist who recently passed away. His area of specialization was social ants. Now, why is that relevant? Because social ants are genuinely communistic in that there is a reproductive queen, and then everybody else, the worker ants and the warrior ants, are all indistinguishable cogs in the wheel. So when he was asked once, I'm paraphrasing, Professor Wilson, what are your views on socialism/communism? His answer is one of the greatest answers I've ever heard. Great idea, wrong species. Because what he meant there is that for certain species, this ethos of equity and so on makes sense. Worker ants are indistinguishable from each other. Human beings are not communistic. Some of us are taller, shorter, harder working, less hardworking, more ambitious, less ambitious. So it is natural that you would have non-equality in outcomes. Messi is Messi because he's better than you. It's not because he got a leg up due to the patriarchy, right? So once you try to impose a socio-political economic system on a species that does not expect that system, it will always fail. That's why communism has been tried in a myriad of cultures, and the answer is always the same. It fails, but yet we keep trying it. Maybe next time it'll work.
Let's talk about some solutions here. Do you think we can work our way out of this parasitic mind culture?
So I always like to infuse some optimism, although maybe in the deep recesses of my mind, that is shrinking ever more. The silent majority, I do believe, abhors these parasitic ideas. Regrettably, though, most are completely cowered into silence for all sorts of what they consider to be justifiable reasons. You, Professor, you have a lot of courage and you have a big platform. So, you're doing a great job. Go get them. But I have to be quiet because, and now here come the justifications. That can't work, right? That's why in the last chapter of The Parasitic Mind, I have I guess, a cry to arms now that's become quite popular. Activate your inner honey badger. The reason why I use that is because the honey badger has been ranked as the fiercest animal in the animal kingdom. It's the size of a small to medium-sized dog, and yet it could withstand an attack by 6 adult lions. Why? Because it is so fierce. So when I ask people to be honey badgers, I don't mean be violent, physically violent, but I mean be ideologically committed to defend your principles, right? If you are in a classroom and your professor says some insane idea, don't sit quietly because you might get a bad grade. Challenge them politely. If you're at a pub and your friend says something that you disagree with, that you find reprehensible, challenge them politely. So I'm not asking people to be impolite or obnoxious or cantankerous. Just participate in the battle of ideas. So some of us have bigger platforms, some of us have smaller platforms, but just use your voice. So I truly believe if the silent majority speaks out in unison, we will get rid of the parasitic ideas.
You know, somebody asked me at a speech that I gave a few days ago, what is it like to be able to speak freely about my ideas and my values, because he really wants to. He's actually Lebanese too, by the way.
Nice.
And they asked me, like, you know, what does it take and what is it like?
Right.
And I looked at them and I said, you know what? It's better than a Chanel bag. They totally got it. But you know, I was like, I don't need physical things. It's freedom. It's so freeing once you're able to take those first steps. And once you take those first steps, maybe society won't let you look back, but you don't want to look back, right? It's so freeing. And that to me is, I mean, it really does bring you happiness more than any bag or anything you would buy.
So I'll give you a personal anecdote that exactly speaks to that. Remember earlier when I said, I never lie? So I have a very exacting code of personal conduct. I'm my worst critic, right? So at the end of the night, when I lay down to go to sleep, the only way that I can forestall insomnia is if when I do the accounting of my day, I felt that I was always authentic and truthful. That's why, by the way, when we do the photo shoot and you ask me smile, I feel a bit uncomfortable because I feel like it's inauthentic for me to be exhibiting an emotion that I wasn't feeling. So it's at that level of purity that I live my life. So therefore, the reason why I always speak out is because I wouldn't be able to fall asleep on that pillow if I thought I saw a murder or rape of truth in the corner and I walked by ignoring it. I would be inauthentic. I would be a fraud. So in a sense, the random vagaries of my personhood are such that I am a honey badger because I am allergic to BS. Now, I understand that people come in many sizes and shapes and colors, so not everybody's going to have my combative style, but everybody can contribute something to the battle of ideas. So I'm not asking you to be Joe Rogan. I'm not asking you to be Gad Saad or Jordan Peterson or whomever. Just within your small sphere of influence, get involved.
Do what you can.
Do what you can.
And I think it's a good segue to the next conversation I want to have with you about happiness, because I do think that when you are authentic, when you get to go to sleep at night knowing that you didn't live in a lie, that is your first step towards happiness. And we are dealing right now with a mental health crisis in the United States. I don't know what it's like in Canada, but I am seeing so many young people mentally broken. Just mentally broken. And your next book was about happiness. And my guess is you wanted to address that, right? At this mental brokenness, this unhappiness. We're the richest times, the most prosperous times, yet the most depressed times and anxious times that we've ever seen. So let's talk a little bit about happiness. Is it even attainable?
Right. So I think we mentioned offline that, and I'll repeat here, about 50% of individual differences in happiness stem from our genes. So some of us are born happy. Some of us have a more sullen, acerbic, cantankerous personality. But that still leaves 50% up for grabs, right? So you may start off with a sunny disposition, much more so than me. But if I make certain choices and adopt certain mindsets, I can surpass you with that other 50%. And so in the book, I go through a bunch of these. And if you want, I can mention a few of them if you'd like.
Well, I mostly want to, I think people can read your book and, you mentioned that it's, marriage and job and meaning and all of these things. But I don't want people to think, which at least that's my perspective. You might have a different perspective on it, that it's almost like happiness is a zero-sum game, right? Because I know people in my life who are just constantly looking for that next thing that's going to make
Yeah.
them happy, and then they're just never happy, right?
So I can speak to that. So in the last chapter of the happiness book, I have a quote from Viktor Frankl, The Meaning of Life. And the quote, I basically just need to replace the word success by happiness. He talks about success is not something that you consciously seek, but rather you pursue certain goals in life of which the downstream effect might be success. I argue happiness has to be pursued in the same way. I don't wake up in the morning and say, what are the steps that I must take today to be happy? But if I've made certain decisions, like waking up next to someone that I go, oh my goodness, what a lovely person to wake up next to. And then I go off to a job where I have existential glee. I'm rubbing my hands in anticipation. And then I come back at night to that lovely person that I woke up next to. That's going to lead to happiness. So it's not the willful pursuit of happiness that will make us happy, but rather the types of decisions and mindsets that we adopt that will hopefully lead to happiness.
Do you think somebody can be truly happy without experiencing adversity first? I mean, I think about somebody like you and your background, and you can share some of it.
Sure.
You grew up in Lebanon, had to escape with your family at age 11. And you certainly have been able to build certain perspectives. So maybe you can enjoy the little things in life, right? You know, we're sitting earlier having a meal and kebab, and you're like, oh my God, this is such indulgence, right? You have such perspective where can one attain happiness without experiencing hardship and adversity?
No, I definitely think, and I think when we talked earlier, I said that it might sound paradoxical for me to say that the tragedy of my childhood has actually made me happy. And it's not, I'm not being flippant or facetious. Well, it allows you to contextualize whatever is bringing you down on a given day, right? So example, when my last book came out, you know, there's tons of media attention and so on. I have to go here, I have to go there. I'm getting stressed out with all the scheduling. And then I stopped for a second. I said, well, wait a minute. You're whining to yourself because a lot of really cool people want to talk to you about your book. And, oh, by the way, you escaped the Lebanese civil war. Why don't you buckle up and stop whining? I mean, this is an internal dialogue I'm having, right? And so by being able to contextualize whatever is worrying us on a given day against the backdrop of some serious adversity that we faced in the past, that's a very powerful tool. I'll give you an example from a guy who came on my show. There's a gentleman by the name of David McCallum, who is arguably the most incredible guest I've ever had. And I've had a lot of great guests. David was accused of a murder when he was 17. He spent 29 years in prison. And at the age of 46, so almost 30 years into his freedom being stolen from him, he was fully exonerated. So he comes on my show to discuss it. As we were sitting down and chatting, I turned to him and I said, you know, David, you must be the reincarnation of Buddha or something, because you're a much better man than I am, because if it happened to me, I want to burn the world down. I'm full of rancor. I'm full of vindictiveness. I'm full of vengefulness. And you seem totally at ease. And so he answered, he goes, you know, I have a sister who's been bedridden with cerebral palsy, and yet she finds the ability to smile and be happy. So if she's able to smile, well, I guess what I went through is not such a big deal. So a guy who had 29 years of his life stolen was still able to reframe that astounding tragedy into, well, you know, it's not so bad. Other people have it worse. So it really is a mind game, right? Happiness is a mind game. There's all sorts of ways by which we could reframe things, infuse gratitude into our lives, think about some of the stressors we faced in our past, and suddenly our current reality doesn't seem so bad.
Yeah, I guess happiness is perspective and mental resilience.
There you go.
You know, I'm going to share a story with you that I heard very recently about a young boy who had to escape a war zone. His parents had to hide him at the bottom of a car and put luggage over him as they were
that story seems familiar.
escaping the Lebanon civil war. Later on, this 11-year-old, correct me if I got the age right, moves to Canada, where he has to introduce himself in front of a classroom, identifies himself as really a child who is usually shot at. The following day or around the same time, this child remembers seeing a bunch of snow and I guess a grim kind of looking environment. And this child says, yeah, the weather is not so great. The snow is kind of freezing, but hey, it's better than bullets.
That's or bombs.
Or bombs.
Yeah,
Did I capture your story right?
It, but although both those stories are on the same day, you said the next day.
Okay.
It was the same day. I introduced myself with the shooting motion, and the snow is falling happened on that same fateful first day. By the way, I didn't mention this to you previously. In grade 7, in that school, I had a teacher. Her name was Mrs. Carsley, that had been an influential teacher in my life. So this is 2 years after I've moved from Lebanon. About 3 years ago, I received an email from Mrs. Carsley. Hi, Gad. I don't know if you remember me. I was your grade 7 teacher. And when COVID finished, because, in Canada, we were locked up for many years, we went out for coffee. So, and I asked her, I said, how was I when I was back? And the way she described me was exactly the way I still view myself today, which shows you that an element of our personality is like leopards can't change their spots. I was the same guy back then as I am today.
Well, that I bring up this story because I think of courage, right? And I compare you to other professors who, I guess, are spineless worms who are castrated. Is that what we call them now?
Invertebrate castrati.
Invertebrate castrati, also known to people like me as castrated worms.
Indeed.
Okay. So we compare you and your courage, and you're willing to be outspoken to these other professors. And you talk about, the diamond cage that they're in because of their whatever promises and salaries, etc. But I think it is very possible that as a child, you developed these skills to have perspective.
It definitely is part of my personhood. So there's the random combination of genes that stem from your parents creating a child. I'm just naturally that way, in that even when I was 5 years old, and Magen Avraham Synagogue in Wadi Abu Jmil in Beirut, Lebanon, and you have to stand up for this prayer. You have to sit down. You have to do to the left, Macarena, to the right. And I look to my dad and I say, why are we doing this? And he's like, shut up, just do it. And at that point, I already had that combative honey badger. What do you mean, just do it? No, explain to me why we're doing it. And then I started getting upset at just kind of lobotomized religious rituals. So I think it's who I am innately, that I don't put up with BS. I'm pathologically authentic, so I can't modulate. And I think that my early childhood built that resistance, that resilience, and that courage.
Professor, why do you think universities are such breeding grounds for disastrous ideas?
So I do talk about this in the parasitic mind. I think each of those parasitic ideas starts off as a noble goal, but then it metastasizes into nonsense. So example, equity feminism is a great idea. It basically says that men and women should not be paid differently if they're doing the exact same. There should be no institutional mechanisms, legal or otherwise, that differentiates or is biased towards one sex or the other. But by that definition of feminism, we should all be feminists. I'm an equity feminist.
Well, there should be equality feminism then, not equity,
okay,
right?
But that's the term, but you're right, equality feminism. Now, then the radical feminists come along and they say, well, if we wish to eradicate the status quo patriarchy, we need to promulgate the idea that there are no innate sex differences between men and women, that all sex differences must be due to arbitrary social construction. So in the service of, quote, eradicating the sexist status quo, if we have to murder and rape truth in the service of that goal, it was well worth it. Well, I argue that no. The pursuit of truth has to be deontological. Deontological means there's an absolute statement that you never deviate. There is no, it's okay to lie if for this reason. The pursuit of truth, the pursuit of science has to be a deontological principle. Freedom of speech has to be a deontological principle. By the way, I'm Jewish. I believe in the right of the most offensive speech, which is Holocaust deniers. Right? I mean, what could be more offensive than denying a historical reality where 6 million people were eradicated like little cockroaches? But in a free society, I have to be willing to tolerate imbeciles, falsehood spreaders, racists. I will beat them with better speech. So that's what I mean by deontological. And so, yeah.
But how come almost every single time bad ideas come from universities?
So Orwell answered it one way. I'll paraphrase it. So he said something to the effect of, it takes intellectuals to come up with some of the dumbest ideas.
Yes.
And I wholeheartedly agree with that. Now, why is that? Because in many cases, the academic who literally lives in the ivory tower is fully decoupled from the autocorrective mechanism of reality, right? So for example, I am housed in a business school. In the business school, there is less parasitic ideas because if you build an economic model to predict the economy that's based on postmodernism, reality will tell you, you suck. Engineering schools also have less parasitic ideas because if you build a bridge using postmodernist indigenous physics as opposed to physics, then the bridge will collapse. So some disciplines have an inoculation against these parasitic ideas because reality will quickly catch up to you. But in other disciplines, in the humanities and some of the social sciences, I could sit on top of my pulpit, pontificate about nonsense. There isn't an autocorrective mechanism that's called reality, and that's why I become the promulgator of nonsense.
And then the damage is done through the students, but they don't get to actually experience the damage and see that. So then they get pumped into society with bad ideas, but there's no consequence to the professors themselves.
Or there is consequences. It's called Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, right? Justin Trudeau, I don't think he's innately a diabolical human being. I mean, I don't know, but my instinct is that he is simply a product of all of the progressive parasitic nonsense that has been fed into him straight out of the womb. And therefore, he's a walking manifestation of every parasitic idea that I discuss in my book. So there are consequences. They're called our future politicians. That's why I would often get from people, well, why do you care so much about these parasitic ideas? They just exist in some silly esoteric department in the humanities. I say, no. But these bad ideas escape. Just like a virus escapes from a lab, it starts off in some esoteric humanities department, but then it becomes your prime minister. Yeah. And then you have problems.
So talking about business school, I want to cause some more trouble in this conversation. So I have a personal philosophy that I've developed actually being an educator, and that is against this concept that people should be a master of only one trade. One of the reasons why I love your background and your CV is that it's frankly all over the place. It's a complete mess. It is. Which I think is so interesting and so valuable. And if you I have a master's in business. And so in business school, we were taught that we should put our team members, our staff members on assembly lines and create org charts with boxes and make sure that they know exactly what their sandbox is and make sure that everybody knows their job description. And God forbid things bleed into others because everybody has to be very focused on their one specific trade, right? And it's the same case in education, by the way. If you look at the way, at least in the United States, education is structured, it's assembly lines, right? You learn math first period, you'll learn literacy second period, you'll learn whatever gender studies third period. Gender studies somehow seeps into everything, right? That is
even math.
That is always generative, right? But the things that actually matter, they really try to box people into different disciplines, which I think really bangs out the human instinct out of you and your ability to really flourish and really build things. And so, when you walked in today, I said the words Leo da Vinci, and I know you were very excited about that. But I think that this concept of the Leonardo da Vinci, the jack of many trades, the ability to expose students to multiple disciplines, not necessarily only one discipline, is so important, is partially why I think we're losing instinct, we're losing innovation, and we're losing them to this parasitic mind virus because of the lack of exposure of reality, which is multidisciplined. And so forgive me for this little rant. I usually don't do
No,
that,
no,
but
please.
I'm really curious for, what you as as evolutionary psychologist and somebody who's studied even academia, what are your thoughts? Are we boxing people in?
Oh, 100%. So academia is the creation of hyper specialists, right? So know a tremendous amount about a very little small minutia and then pump out a million papers on that small minutia. Never deviate from your stay in your lane focus, right? I've lived my life, and thank you for pointing that out on my CV, exactly as a rejection of that. But by the way, when I would get approaches from universities to hire me, oftentimes where my candidacy would fail is they would say exactly what you said, but it wasn't viewed as a positive. You're all over the place. Why aren't you focused? And then I would say, but isn't it more impressive to publish in medicine, in economics, in politics, in psychology, in marketing, than if I were publishing in only one small epsilon field? But in academia, the answer is unequivocally no, you should be a hyper specialist. All big ideas always happen at the intersection of disciplines, right? The mapping of the human genome required people from many disciplines to come together in order to crack literally the human genome. Okay. So Leonardo da Vinci is the great guy that he is exactly for the reasons that you said. He's a sculptor and a futurist and an engineer and a painter. He's both social sciences and humanities and natural sciences. He's the ultimate polymath. So when I'm training my students, I tell them, look, if you want a safe academic career, then here is the prescription: be a hyper specialist. Life is short. You want to explore many intellectual landscapes. So my advice to you is be a polymath. So I give them both sides, and then they decide based on their risk reward ratio how they want to go through it. But I completely agree with you. Not only in the disciplines that I've published in, I'm a polymath, but even, for example, the fact that I decided that I wasn't willing to only publish academic papers. I think I get as much influence in coming on your show and having thousands of people consume our ideas as I would in publishing an academic paper that's going to be read by 12 people. In 2017, I was invited to speak at the Stanford Business School. The gentleman who was hosting me, who's a professor also, consumer psychologist, takes me out the night before. He says, oh, I looked at some of your background, and you're a friend of Joe Rogan's, and you appear on his show. I said, yeah, actually, I'm going to appear on his show soon. He goes, yeah, well, we don't condone that at Stanford with that smugness. I said, well, you don't condone what at Stanford? He goes, well, we don't do our research so that it could be sexy enough so that we go talk about it on Joe Rogan. I said, well, I don't do the research also so I could appear on Joe Rogan, but I could do good research and appear on Joe Rogan. It's not mutually exclusive. Doesn't it make sense for me to excite 20 million people about the research that I do rather than have 4 people? I actually told him, and he didn't like it. I said, I prefer to not have my paper being read by the editor, the reviewer, my mom, and my girlfriend, right? And he didn't like that because he viewed it as I'm being haughty towards academia, whereas he was from his ivory tower at Stanford looking down on Joe Rogan. Well, now many of these guys will send me emails saying, dear Gad, can you connect me with Joe Rogan? So now the metric has changed. Now they see the value of that. Well, I'm in the business of creating and disseminating knowledge. I'm not haughty. Any place, anywhere I can go where I can hopefully spread good ideas, I'm there.
I think it's also more fun when you get to do multiple things, right? Like life is about that. And so I hope that anybody that's listening that feels that they're really boxed and they, maybe feeling a little suffocated can take some of this advice from you. And at least even for me as an educator, allow your children to have exposure to many different things.
Indeed.
You know how many moms and dads I know that will enroll their kid in only one sport because they think that if they do more than one sport, it's going to distract them. I mean, you're practically a soccer expert, right? It's like, does it make any sense that a child would only play soccer and not do soccer and basketball and judo or whatever?
You develop completely different skills by doing different sports. My son recently told me, he goes, Daddy, every time we play any sport, you seem to be really good at it. because I'm athletic, because I've got good hand-eye or eye-foot coordination, precisely because I've sampled from the buffet of many different athletic pursuits.
So fun. Okay, speaking of fun, I want to play a game with you.
Here we go.
This is going to be the hardest game you'll ever play, but it's PragerU. We've got to challenge you, and there'll be no participation trophy at the end. I guarantee you
Go
that.
for it.
Okay, the game is called Would You Rather. So you're going to have to choose between these two options.
Yes.
If you feel very strongly that you want to elaborate, I'll let you do it, but we're going to try to get through a lot of these concepts together very quickly. We'll start with an easy one, at least I think it is. Would you rather tell your wife a white lie or tell her something that would hurt her feelings?
Right. So that speaks to the earlier point I made about deontological versus consequentialist ethics. Deontological would be never tell a lie. Consequentialist would be it's okay to tell a lie if you want to spare someone's feelings. Well, I always tell people the secret to marriage is when you hear the following question, do I look fat in those jeans? Put on your consequentialist hat and say you've never looked more beautiful. So to answer that question, I would rather tell her a white lie and spare her feelings than to hurt her.
Okay, no comment from me. Would you rather gain more influence or gain more wealth?
More influence, although given the current predicament that I find myself in, the wealth would allow me to escape my current reality so that I could gain more influence. So on the abstract, more influence, but money also talks, it buys you freedom.
Would you rather live in a constant lie or lose your entire career?
I can't live in a lie. As I mentioned earlier, I'm authentic to a fault, so let it be.
I had a feeling you'd say that. Okay, would you rather live in regret or live with guilt?
Guilt makes it seem as though I've done something wrong. And again, being very morally scrupulous, I can't live with the sense of longing guilt. And so maybe regret. Oh, I wish I would have taken that art class that I never ended up taking. So I'll take regret over guilt.
All right. I know that was a tough one. Okay. Would you rather lose your freedom or live in danger?
Freedom is everything. Freedom and truth. In chapter 1 of the Parasitic Mind, I talk about those being my two ideals. So freedom rules.
Freedom all the way. Would you rather be a master of a trade or a jack of all trades?
I'm going to go with the latter, given that Leonardo da Vinci is my hero.
All right. I gave you an easy one here. Okay. Would you rather be around competent people or around diverse people?
Given that diversity today means irrelevant cues, I'm going to go with surround myself with competent people who know what they're doing.
Especially if it's your doctor, right? Or
Exactly.
your pilot.
Exactly.
Would you rather be the first at accomplishing something or one of many exceptional?
I do have that pioneer complex, and so I'll go with the former. Be the first.
You'd rather be the first.
Plant that flag that says Gad Saad rules.
All right. That's good. I didn't expect that. Okay. This is a good one, I think. Would you rather live in Canada when the weather is perfect for the season or in Texas during a muggy storm season?
Texas.
Texas all the way, baby. Texas all the way. All right. Would you rather be a Jew in Lebanon, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Algeria, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, or select any of the other 50 Muslim states, or a Muslim in Israel?
I'm Muslim in Israel.
Would you rather play soccer or sheshbesh, backgammon?
Soccer.
Soccer?
I love sheshbesh, and I there's a story of how I won my wife the first day that I met her parents. They're Lebanese also. He brings out, in Arabic you say tawle, which is the sheshbesh, right? And I said to him, we'll play up to 5. If I win, I get your daughter. I won. Many years later, he told me that I allowed you to win.
Of course.
Because I thought you were a good guy.
Of course. Never give the win away, right?
Exactly.
Okay, final one. Would you rather be part of a winning team or the star of a mediocre team?
Winning team.
Be part of a winning team.
Be part of a winning team.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
Well, it's a great way to end this episode. Professor, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so
I
much.
love
That was
talking
really
to
fun.
you.
That was great.
Really fun.
Thank you.